The rancher placed a carefully wrapped wedding dress in her hands, but the black woman could only stare at it, because she had spent her entire life making beautiful things for others and never owning one for herself. Sarah Whitmore stood frozen beside the old sewing table, her fingers trembling against the blue and white fabric as the winter wind tapped against the wooden windows of her small shop. William Carter said nothing, letting the silence speak, while the town waited to see what she would do with the one gift she never expected. But why was this simple dress enough to bring tears to a woman who had survived everything alone? Stay with us and discover Sarah's unforgettable journey. The rain came quietly to Red Hollow that afternoon. It slid down the wooden windows of Sarah Whitmore's little sewing shop, turning the dusty street outside into a ribbon of mud and shallow puddles. The sign above the door creaked with every cold gust of wind, but inside, the room was warm from the small iron stove burning near the corner. Sarah sat beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp, her needle moving steadily through a piece of white fabric. It was a wedding dress, the kind of dress young women dreamed about, the kind Sarah had spent years creating for others. Her fingers moved carefully over every stitch. She knew exactly how much pressure to use, exactly where the thread needed to sit, exactly how to make a simple piece of cloth become something a woman would remember for the rest of her life. A young bride from the Northern Valley had come that morning to pick up the finished gown. She had stood in front of the mirror with tears in her eyes, turning slowly as the fabric followed her movement. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," the young woman had whispered. Sarah had smiled and fixed one small wrinkle near the sleeve. "You'll look lovely on your wedding day." The bride thanked her and left with the dress carefully wrapped in brown paper. Then the shop became quiet again. Sarah looked down at her own hands. They were rough from years of work, small cuts from needles, faint marks from carrying wood, washing clothes, and repairing whatever needed repairing. She leaned back in her chair and pulled the sleeve of her brown dress down over her wrist. The dress had once been a fine one. 8 years ago, it had been the nicest thing she owned. Now the fabric around the elbows had thinned so much that the morning light could almost pass through it. But Sarah did not replace it, not because she could not, because there was always something else that needed the money. A winter coat for her youngest brother, a doctor's visit, a pair of boots before the snow arrived, a few extra pounds of flour when times were difficult. Somewhere along the way, Sarah had stopped asking herself what she wanted. There were always people who needed something more, and she had become very good at giving. Outside the shop, a wagon rolled slowly through the wet street. William Carter sat in the driver's seat, one hand resting on the reins. The 40-mile wind from the San Juan Mountains had followed him down the road all morning, carrying the smell of pine and cold earth. He had come into Red Hollow to pick up supplies for his ranch and check a shipment of feed that had arrived at the freight station. William was a man people noticed without trying, not because he spoke loudly, he rarely did, but because he carried himself like someone who had spent his whole life relying on his own hands. His ranch sat 12 miles outside town, surrounded by open land, rough hills, and long stretches of fence that needed repairing every season. He was known as a fair rancher, a quiet one, the kind of man who paid his workers on time and remembered the names of their children. As he passed Sarah's sewing shop, something caught his attention. A little girl stood near the general store, struggling with a loose scarf around her neck. The old knitted fabric slipped from her hands and fell into a muddy puddle. Before anyone else moved, Sarah stepped out of her shop. She crossed the street without hesitation. The little girl looked close to tears. Sarah knelt down, picked up the wet scarf, and gently placed her own wool scarf around the child's shoulders. "There now," Sarah said softly. "You'll need something warm more than I do." The girl smiled and ran back toward her mother. William watched from across the street. He had seen kindness before, but he noticed something else. Sarah turned back toward the shop. Without the scarf around her neck, She pulled the collar of her thin dress higher against the cold rain. Her shoulders trembled once, only once. Then she walked inside and returned to her sewing. William remained still for a moment. The rain continued falling, the street emptied, and somehow, the woman who had just given away the only thing keeping her warm stayed on his mind. Later that afternoon, William entered the shop. Sarah looked up from her work. "Mr. Carter, Sarah." He placed a small package of sewing supplies on the counter. "I heard you were waiting on this thread shipment." She glanced at the package, then at him. "I can pay you." William shook his head. "I didn't say you couldn't." A small silence passed between them. Sarah opened her purse immediately. It was not suspicion, it was habit, William noticed. She counted every coin carefully, even though the amount was small. "You don't have to repay every kindness," he said. Sarah looked at him. "I prefer to." William had no answer for that, because he believed her. For Sarah Whitmore, accepting something freely felt almost stranger than going without it. Before he left, William noticed the worn brown dress again, the faded stitching, the repaired sleeve, the careful way she moved so the damaged fabric would not tear further. "Has that dress been with you a long time?" he asked. Sarah glanced down. "Yes, how long?" She thought for a moment. 8 years. William looked surprised. Sarah simply folded the fabric in her hands. "It still works." And then she returned to her sewing. William Carter walked back into the cold afternoon with that sentence following him. "It still works." For years, Sarah Whitmore had treated herself the same way, like something that only needed to keep working, not something that deserved to be cherished. And William had a feeling that no one in Red Hollow had ever stopped long enough to notice. For the next few weeks, he found himself taking the longer road into town. He told himself it was because the northern trail was better after the rain. The ground near Carter Ranch had become soft, and the wagon wheels sank too deep near the creek crossing. But the truth was simpler. The road passed by Sarah Whitmore's sewing shop, and sometimes, through the front window, he could see the warm glow of her oil lamp and the steady movement of her hands. Sarah always worked. When the sun came up, she was already sweeping the front steps. When the town clock reached noon, she was still bent over her sewing table. When most houses in Red Hollow had gone dark, a small line of light remained beneath the door of her shop. William knew hard work. He had built a ranch with his own hands. But Sarah's kind of hard work was different. It was quiet, almost invisible. One cold morning in early November, William stopped his wagon beside the shop carrying a stack of firewood. Sarah opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Carter, Sarah." Her eyes moved from him to the wood. "Something wrong with your fireplace?" "No." "Then why are you bringing me firewood?" William adjusted his gloves. "Because your woodpile is low." Sarah looked toward the side of the building. The pile was smaller than she wanted him to notice. "I can handle it." William nodded. "I know." That answer made her pause. Most people said things like, "You shouldn't have to," or "Let me help because you can't." William said something different. He knew she could. He simply did not think she should have to do everything alone. Sarah stepped aside and let him carry the wood inside, the small room filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine. She watched him stack every piece neatly beside the stove. When he finished, she reached for her purse. William sighed quietly. "Sarah, I'm paying you. For firewood, for the trouble." He looked at her for a moment. Then he placed his hat back on his head. "Miss Whitmore, if you pay me every time I do something kind, I'll spend my whole life collecting coins from you." A faint smile appeared on her face. It disappeared almost as quickly. But William noticed. He noticed everything. A few days later, He brought a small basket from the Carter Ranch kitchen. Inside were canned peaches, bread, coffee, and a small jar of honey. Sarah looked at it suspiciously. "I cannot accept this. It's food. I know what it is. Then why not?" She looked away. "The Miller family has a sick baby. Mrs. Turner's husband lost work after the wagon accident. There are others who need it more." William leaned against the doorframe. "And you?" Sarah blinked. "What about me?" He pointed gently toward the basket. "Where do you fit on your own list?" The question stayed between them. The stove crackled. Outside, a horse passed on the muddy street. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it, because she had no answer. Then, William returned to his ranch under a darkening sky. The Carter property sat high against the mountain slope. The fences stretched for miles. Horses moved quietly in the pasture, their breath visible in the cold air. William removed his coat and entered the ranch house. His sister, Margaret, was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through letters. "You went to Red Hollow again," she said. William hung his coat near the door. "I had business there." Margaret smiled slightly. "You always have business there now." William poured himself a cup of coffee. He did not respond. Margaret studied him. "She's different." William looked up. "Who?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You know who." He looked down into his coffee. The steam disappeared slowly. "She doesn't know how to let anyone do something for her." Margaret folded the letter in her hand. "Maybe no one ever gave her a reason to learn." William stayed quiet, because he knew that was true. A week later, he learned something he had not expected. It happened at the small diner near the train station. William had stopped for coffee after delivering cattle papers to the freight office. Sarah was there picking up a repaired pair of gloves for a customer. An older woman behind the counter recognized her. "Sarah, I still remember when James Parker wanted to marry you." Sarah immediately lowered her eyes. William, sitting nearby, listened quietly. "He was a good man," the woman continued. Sarah folded the gloves carefully. "He was. You loved him, didn't you?" The room became still. Sarah looked toward the window. Outside, snow clouds were gathering over the mountains. "He was kind. That wasn't my question." Sarah did not answer right away. Then she said softly, "My brothers and sister needed me." The woman sighed. "That was nearly 15 years ago." Sarah gave a small nod. "I know." William watched her hands, the same hands that repaired clothes, prepared meals, raised children, held together a home that was never really meant to be carried by one person. Later, when they stepped outside, William walked beside her through the cold street. "Sarah." She stopped. "Yes? You ever regret it?" She looked at him. "Regret what?" "Giving up that life." The wind moved between the buildings. For a moment, William thought she would not answer. Then she said, "I don't regret loving my family." A pause. "But sometimes—" Her voice became quieter. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if someone had asked what I wanted." William did not say anything. He simply stood beside her. And for the first time, Sarah did not rush to fill the silence. The mountains behind Red Hollow turned white as winter approached. And somewhere between the old sewing table, the quiet cups of coffee, and the man who kept showing up without asking for anything in return, something inside Sarah Whitmore began to change. Not quickly, not loudly, but enough for William Carter to see. A door that had been closed for years had finally started to move. Winter settled over Red Hollow slowly. The mountains around the town turned white, and the roads became harder to travel. Wagons moved carefully over frozen ground, and smoke from chimneys rose straight into the gray morning sky. For Sarah Whitmore, winter had always meant more work, more mending, more coats needing repairs, More families counting every coin before deciding what they could afford. She never complained. She simply adjusted. That was what William noticed most. Sarah did not fight against hardship. She learned how to carry it. But over the months, something small began to change. She started leaving the door of her shop open a little longer when William stopped by. She started pouring him coffee before he asked. And sometimes, when he told a quiet joke, she let herself laugh before remembering she was supposed to be serious. William never pushed. He understood some things could not be rushed. A wild horse could not be forced to trust a hand. Neither could a wounded heart. One afternoon, William arrived at the sewing shop carrying a wooden box. Sarah looked up from her table. The box was old, the edges were worn smooth. "What is that?" she asked. William set it carefully on the counter. "Something I've been working on." Sarah glanced at him. "You made it?" He nodded. "Not very well." That brought a small smile from her. William Carter admitting something isn't perfect. "I didn't say I made many things imperfect." She looked at him. "Just this one?" He smiled slightly. "Just this one." For a moment the room felt lighter. Then William looked toward the window. The street outside was quiet. Most of the townspeople had already gone home before the evening cold arrived. "Sarah," he said. Something in his voice made her hands stop moving. She placed the needle down. "Yes," William took a breath. He was a man who could ride through storms, negotiate cattle deals, and handle difficult decisions without hesitation. But standing in that little sewing shop, he seemed more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "I want to show you something." He opened the box. Inside was folded fabric. Sarah did not move. Slowly, William lifted the dress from the box. It was beautiful, not bright, not something meant to draw attention from across a room. It was elegant. Deep blue fabric with soft white details along the sleeves and collar. The kind of dress that looked like it belonged to someone who had always known she was worthy of beautiful things. Sarah stared at it. Her fingers reached out, then stopped before touching the fabric. "It's for someone else," she whispered. William looked at her. "No." She looked confused. "Then whose is it?" He stepped closer and gently placed the dress in her hands. "Yours." Sarah looked down. For several seconds, she said nothing. The sewing room was silent except for the soft crackling of the stove. "Mine?" William nodded. "I asked Mrs. Bell from the dress shop in town to make it." Sarah ran her fingers over the fabric. "I don't understand." William watched her carefully. "I know," that answer made her look up. He continued, "I know you don't understand, because you've spent your whole life making sure everyone else had what they needed." Sarah looked away. The words landed too close. "I have clothes," she said quietly. "I know. I have a home. I know. I have work. I know." William paused, then his voice softened. "But you've never had something just because you wanted it." Sarah looked back at the dress. The truth was sitting there in her hands, not a repaired dress, not something passed down, not something purchased because it was practical, something chosen for her. William stepped back slightly, giving her room. "I've watched you spend your whole life making beautiful things for everyone else," he said. His voice was steady. "I wanted you to have one thing that was made only for you." Sarah swallowed. She looked toward the small mirror near the wall. In the reflection, she saw herself, the same woman who had spent years standing behind that sewing table. The same woman who had fixed everyone else's torn sleeves. The same woman who had forgotten what it felt like to receive something without needing to earn it first. "Why?" she asked. William's expression changed. Not with pity, not with sympathy, something deeper. "Because I love you, Sarah." The room became completely still. Outside, a horse moved somewhere near the street. A wagon wheel rolled over frozen ground. But inside the shop, Sarah heard only those words. William Carter had always been careful. He had never demanded her attention, never asked her to leave behind the life she had built. But now he stood before her and finally said what he had carried quietly for years. "I've loved you longer than I should probably admit." Sarah looked at him. "How long?" William gave a small breath. "Long enough that I stopped counting." Her eyes lowered. "And you never said anything?" He shook his head. "You had enough people needing something from you." A pause. "I didn't want to become another person asking you to give." That was the moment something inside Sarah shifted, because all her life people had asked for her time, her strength, her patience, her sacrifices. But William was the first person who seemed to want nothing from her except herself. Sarah sat down slowly. The dress remained in her hands. She did not cry. Not yet. She simply looked at the fabric, the careful stitching, the small details, the color she had once admired through a shop window, but walked away from, because there was always something more important. William stood quietly. He did not tell her what to feel. He did not ask for an answer. After a long silence, Sarah whispered, "I don't know what to do with something like this." William's voice was gentle. "You don't have to do anything." She looked up. "Just keep it." For the first time in many years, Sarah Whitmore held something that belonged only to her, and she realized the hardest thing she had ever done was not surviving. It was allowing herself to be loved. For several days after William Carter placed the dress in her hands, Sarah Whitmore kept it folded carefully inside the wooden box. She did not hide it, but she did not leave it where everyone could see. It sat on the small shelf beside her sewing table, covered with a clean piece of cloth. Every morning, she noticed it. Every evening, before she went to sleep, she looked at it once, not because she doubted William, because she was still learning how to believe something could truly belong to her. Winter moved deeper into the San Juan Mountains. Snow covered the roads leading toward Carter Ranch, and the sound of horses' hooves became softer against the frozen ground. William continued visiting Red Hollow. Nothing between them changed quickly. There were no grand promises shouted in the street. No dramatic declarations, just small moments. A cup of coffee waiting on Sarah's table when he arrived. A second chair pulled closer to the stove, a quiet ride through the valley when the weather allowed. For the first time in years, Sarah began leaving a little space in her day for something that was not work. Then the news reached town, and with news came whispers. People in Red Hollow had always talked. They talked about crops, about weather, about who owed money at the general store. And now they talked about Sarah Whitmore and William Carter. Clara Beaumont was among the first to bring the subject into the open. She stood behind the counter of her fabric shop, arranging rolls of cloth while customers gathered nearby. "William Carter is a good man," she said carefully. The way she said it made everyone understand there was more coming, but people will wonder if he knows what he's doing. Sarah heard the words when she came in to pick up a shipment of thread. She did not respond. She simply checked the receipt, counted the packages, and thanked Clara. That almost bothered Clara more. She expected anger. She expected an argument. Instead, Sarah carried the box of thread back to her shop and continued working. But that evening, when she opened the wooden box holding the blue and white dress, her hands stayed on the fabric longer than usual. Not because Clara's words hurt, because Sarah had spent so many years believing other people's comfort mattered more than her own happiness. The next morning, a familiar wagon rolled into Red Hollow. Sarah recognized it before she saw the faces, the old wagon wheels, the faded brown coat hanging over the side. Thomas Whitmore stepped down first. He was no longer the young boy who used to run through their family yard with dirt on his boots. He wore a city-made coat now. His hands were clean. His shoes had never touched a farm field. Behind him came Lucy. Sarah stood in the doorway of her shop. For a moment, she forgot everything else. Thomas, Sarah, they hugged. And for a brief second, she was 16 again, before the years of responsibility, before she learned how heavy a person's life could become. Lucy smiled. "You look well." Sarah smiled back. "So do you." They spent the afternoon catching up. Thomas told stories about his work. Lucy talked about her home. They laughed over old memories, but as the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, Sarah noticed something. Neither of them had asked about the dress. Neither had asked about William. Neither had asked what Sarah wanted. The conversation always returned to what everyone else needed. The next day, they sat together in Sarah's small kitchen. 3 cups of coffee rested on the wooden table. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Sarah, there is something we need to talk about." She folded her hands. "Of course." Thomas glanced at Lucy, then back at his sister. "You know how much we love you." Sarah nodded. "I do, and this marriage—" He paused. Sarah waited. "Things will change." Outside, snow fell quietly against the window. "What things?" she asked. Thomas looked down. "The ranch you've always helped with, Lucy's children, the family home." Sarah listened. Not angry, not yet, just listening. Lucy spoke softly. "Sarah, you've always been the one everyone could count on." A small silence followed. Sarah looked toward the shelf where the wooden box sat. The dress inside, the first thing anyone had ever chosen only for her. Thomas noticed her looking away. "Sarah." She turned back. For the first time in her life, she did not immediately say yes. She did not offer a solution. She did not promise to fix everything. And that silence frightened them more than an argument would have, because they had never seen Sarah choose herself before. That evening, another piece of news reached town. Samuel Hayes had been speaking, and he had not been speaking kindly. He told people William Carter was making a mistake, that a wealthy rancher marrying Sarah was only an attempt to prove something. By the time the words reached Sarah, they had already traveled through half of Red Hollow. She stood outside her sewing shop, holding a basket of folded cloth. William arrived just before sunset. He saw her expression immediately. "Sarah." She looked at him. For the first time since they had grown close, there was uncertainty in her eyes. Not about him, about herself. "William." He stepped closer. "What happened?" She looked down at the basket in her hands, then back at him. "Why me?" The question was quiet, but it carried years behind it. William did not answer quickly, because he knew this was not about Samuel Hayes. It was not about Clara Beaumont. It was about every year Sarah had spent believing she had to earn her place in someone's life. Finally, William said, "Because you are Sarah." The wind moved through the empty street, and I don't want the woman who fixes everything. He looked at her gently. I want the woman who laughs when she forgets she is supposed to be serious. Sarah looked away. The old habit returned, the instinct to step back, to protect herself, to make things easier for everyone else. But this time, she did not walk away. She simply stood there, and William stayed beside her. For the first time, Sarah understood something that scared her more than being alone. She understood that choosing herself meant disappointing people who had always depended on her. And soon, she would have to decide whether she was brave enough to do it. For several days, Sarah Whitmore carried that thought with her. She carried it while cutting fabric, while sweeping the floor of her little sewing shop, while standing beside the stove each morning, watching steam rise from her coffee cup before the sun reached the mountains. Red Hollow had always known Sarah as someone who could endure anything, but no one had ever asked what endurance had cost her. The words from Thomas still echoed in her mind. You've always been the one everyone could count on. It was true, and somehow, that was the part that hurt the most. Because Sarah had spent so many years being needed, that people had forgotten she was also a person with dreams of her own. One evening, she walked alone to the small church at the edge of town. The wooden steps creaked beneath her boots. Inside, the room was empty, the same room where she had attended weddings for other people, the same place where she had watched young women walk down the aisle wearing dresses she had carefully sewn. Sarah stood near the front pew and looked at the simple wooden altar. She imagined herself standing there, not as a seamstress, not as a sister, not as the woman everyone called when something needed fixing, just Sarah. For the first time, the thought did not feel impossible. A few days later, Thomas came back to her house. This time he did not bring requests. He brought an apology. He stood near the doorway, removing his gloves slowly. "I've been thinking about what I said." Sarah stayed quiet. Thomas looked around the small room, the patched curtains, the old table, the chair Sarah had repaired more times than she could remember. "This house still looks the same." Sarah smiled faintly. It needed to. Thomas lowered his eyes. Then he noticed the wooden box on the shelf, the one holding the dress. "You're really doing this?" It was not a question. Sarah placed her hand over the box. "Yes." Thomas was silent. For years he had seen Sarah as the person who held everything together. It was difficult to accept that she could finally want something for herself. "I thought you would always be here," he admitted. Sarah looked at him. "I know." And that was the hardest part. She knew, she understood. But understanding someone's pain did not mean giving away your own life to make it disappear. "I love you, Thomas," she said softly. His eyes lifted. "But I cannot spend the rest of my life proving it." The room became quiet. Thomas looked away, and for the first time he seemed to understand the years he had never counted, the meals she skipped, the opportunities she gave away, the life she placed on hold. Across town, Samuel Hayes continued spreading his doubts. He stopped men outside the general store. He spoke quietly over coffee. He suggested William Carter was making a decision he would regret. When William heard about it, he only tightened the reins on his horse and continued riding. He had spent too many years letting other people's opinions decide what mattered. He would not let that happen now, but Sarah was not so certain. One evening, she found William near the Carter Ranch barn. Snow rested on the wooden fence posts. The horses shifted quietly inside. "William." He turned. The moment he saw her face, he knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Sarah held the edge of her coat. "People are saying you don't really know what you're doing." William watched her carefully. "And do you believe them?" She looked down. That answer hurt more than anything. Not because she doubted him, because a part of her still wondered if happiness was something she was allowed to have. William walked closer. She looked up. "I need you to understand something." The wind moved through the empty pasture. "I didn't choose you because you needed someone." He paused. "I chose you because I have spent years watching you stand strong when nobody was standing beside you." Sarah's eyes softened. "I'm afraid." William nodded. "I know. I'm afraid I'll hurt people. You might." She looked surprised. William continued. "Doing the right thing does not mean nobody gets hurt." Those words stayed with her because they were honest, not a promise that everything would be easy, not a promise that everyone would understand, just the truth. The next morning, Sarah opened the wooden box. She lifted the blue and white dress carefully. For a long moment, she stood there. Then she placed the old brown dress she had worn for 8 years beside it, not to throw it away, not to forget it, but to remember. The woman who wore that old dress had survived. She had protected everyone. She had given everything she had. But she was allowed to become someone new. On the morning of the wedding, Red Hollow woke beneath a clear winter sky. The church doors opened. People gathered along the wooden walkway. Some came because they supported Sarah. Some came because they were curious. But when Sarah stepped forward wearing the dress William had made for her, the entire room became quiet. She did not walk in like someone asking permission. She walked in like someone who had finally accepted her own place in the world. William stood waiting, his eyes found hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The cowboy who had seen her when nobody else did, the woman who had finally allowed herself to be seen. After the ceremony, William led Sarah outside, but instead of taking her toward the wagon, he stopped near the edge of town. "There's somewhere else I want to show you." They rode a short distance beyond the old road near Red Hollow. Sarah recognized the place before they arrived. The small house, the one where she had grown up, the one she thought had been lost years ago. She turned toward him. "William." He handed her a small set of keys. "I bought it last spring." Sarah stared at him. "You bought my parents' house?" He nodded. "I didn't buy it for you to stay trapped in the past." He looked toward the old porch. "I fixed it because I wanted you to have a place where your memories could stay." Sarah held the keys tightly. "Why?" William smiled softly. "Because your whole life you kept everyone else." A pause. "I wanted to keep something for you." Sarah looked at the house, then at the man beside her. And finally, after a lifetime of giving everything away, she'd let herself receive. Years later, people across Colorado would still talk about Sarah Whitmore's sewing. They would talk about the beautiful wedding dresses that came from her small workshop. They would talk about the woman who could turn old fabric into something beautiful. But those who knew her best remembered something else. They remembered that Sarah never stopped being kind. She never stopped helping others. She simply learned that kindness could include herself. And in the corner of her home, carefully folded away, remained the blue and white dress. Not as a reminder of the day she became someone's wife, but as a reminder of the day she finally became her own. Because sometimes the hardest journey is not crossing mountains or surviving storms. Sometimes it is the quiet journey of believing that you, too, deserve a place beside the fire. Imagine spending years giving every piece of yourself away. Imagine waking before sunrise, carrying responsibilities no one else sees, and forgetting what it feels like to want something simply because it brings you joy. Then one day, someone looks at you and does not see what you can provide, but sees who you truly are. That was Sarah's journey. Her story reminds us that love is not always about being rescued. Sometimes it is about finally allowing someone to stand beside you. It is about healing old wounds, accepting kindness, and understanding that a life spent caring for others does not mean you must disappear from your own story. If you have ever known someone who gave everything and asked for nothing, tell us their story in the comments. And if this journey touched your heart, stay with us. Subscribe and join us for more stories of love, courage, second chances, and the quiet moments that reveal the strength hidden inside ordinary lives. There are many more unforgettable tales waiting for you in the chapters ahead.